She had been a customer at First Meridian Bank on Tanner Avenue for 31 years. This is not a small fact. 31 years is a relationship. It is the span of time in which a person opens accounts and closes accounts, takes loans and pays them back, changes addresses twice and updates the paperwork. Both times loses a spouse and adjusts the estate documentation, and is recognized in the particular way that a long-standing customer of a neighborhood bank is recognized by name, by face, by the specific timbre of a relationship built slowly over decades of correct behavior. Her name was Dorothy Elaine Carmichael. She was 68 years old. She was 5'3" with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She dressed with the specific intentionality of a woman who had spent a career being seen in rooms where she had to be taken seriously, which is to say she dressed well consistently without ostentation, with the kind of careful attention that communicates not vanity but self-respect. She had retired 4 years ago from a position she had held for 22 years, branch manager of the Jefferson Avenue Public Library. 22 years managing a public institution, its staff of 14, its budget, its programming calendar, its renovation projects, its relationship with the city council that controlled its funding and the community it served. She had done this work with the specific combination of patience and precision that public service requires, and she had done it well enough that when she retired, the library system named the children's reading room after her. Before the library, she had spent 11 years in school administration, 2 years as an assistant principal at Garfield Middle School, 9 years as the principal of Eastside Elementary, a position she had held through 3 school board changes, 2 budget crises, and 1 building renovation that required the school to operate from temporary classrooms for a full academic year, while the permanent structure was brought up to code. She had managed it. She had managed all of it. She had managed the school board when its members changed, and she had to reestablish relationships with each new member. She had managed the budget crises by cutting every administrative cost she could identify before she cut anything that affected students. She had managed the renovation by organizing the temporary classrooms herself, personally, during a summer when everyone assumed she would be taking a break. She did not take breaks from things that needed managing. She had learned this from her mother, Eunice, who had raised 4 children in a house on Orchard Street and had managed that household with the same meticulous attention that her daughter later brought to libraries and schools. Nothing wasted. Nothing overlooked, everything in its place, and every person in the family knowing what their responsibilities were and why those responsibilities mattered. Eunice had also been a woman who dressed carefully every day regardless of what the day required, because she said, "You never know who you are going to meet, or what you are going to need to be taken seriously about, and you do not want the way you look to be the reason someone does not hear what you are saying." Dorothy had inherited this. She had been dressing with this specific intentionality since she was 30 years old and had walked into a budget meeting where she was the only black person in the room and the youngest person in the room, and had decided that day that she would never again walk into a room where she needed to be taken seriously without having done everything in her power to ensure that her appearance communicated exactly what she wanted it to communicate. She had kept that decision for 38 years. She kept it on a Tuesday morning in November when she put on her dark green wool coat and her reading glasses and drove to First Meridian Bank on Tanner Avenue. The Dorothy E. Carmichael Children's Reading Room. There was a bronze plaque. Her daughter Yolanda had cried at the dedication. Dorothy had not, because she was the one being dedicated, to which she considered a role that required composure, though she had come close on 2 separate occasions during the ceremony. She had also, in those 22 years, been the primary administrative contact for the library's banking relationship with First Meridian. She had opened and managed the library's institutional accounts. She had coordinated the payroll processing. She had attended the branch's annual customer appreciation events. She knew the branch manager or had known him before he retired 3 years ago by first name, and he had known her. She had also been for 9 years as the institutional banking contact for the Jefferson Avenue Library, the person who managed the library's relationship with this specific branch. The accounts she had maintained, the general operating account, the payroll account, the restricted endowment fund, the Friends of the Library donor account represented over the 22 years she held the position. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in institutional funds managed with complete accuracy through several branch managers, 2 bank ownership changes, and 1 major system conversion that had required extraordinary care to ensure no data was lost in the transfer. She had managed it. Every piece of it. She was not, in other words, an anonymous person walking into a bank. She was a woman with a 31-year documented relationship with the institution, a woman who had come in for the specific purpose of conducting business at an account that her documentation would confirm was hers, in a branch she had visited so many times that the tellers in the first 2 rows still greeted her by name. She was also on a Tuesday morning in November a 68-year-old black woman who had walked in alone, and this was the only fact that Officer Wayne Dellert appeared to register. Dellert was 32. He was a contracted security officer assigned to First Meridian's Tanner Avenue branch 4 days a week. He had been in this role for 14 months. He was a tall man, wide-shouldered, with the specific alertness of someone who has been placed in a position of minor authority and has decided that the authority is less minor than the position implies. He had 1 prior written warning on his employment record issued 8 months before this morning for conduct toward a customer that his supervisor had characterized as unnecessary and disproportionate. The warning had not changed his approach. It had not been followed by additional oversight. The prior warning had been issued after an incident involving a man who had come into the branch to dispute a fee on his account. The man had presented documentation. The dispute had been legitimate. Dellert had approached him in the lobby before he reached the teller line, had asked for identification in a manner that the man described as confrontational, and had, when the man declined to produce identification on demand in the middle of the lobby, followed him to the teller window and remained beside him throughout the transaction. The teller who processed the transaction had filed an internal incident report. The supervisor had reviewed it and had issued the written warning. Dellert had signed the acknowledgement of the warning, which was the administrative requirement, and had otherwise continued his work in the way he had conducted it before the warning, which is to say, he had continued to make his own assessments about which customers in the lobby warranted his specific attention, and those assessments continued to correlate in a pattern that any review of the prior incident and the subsequent 14 months would have identified with certain categories of customers. No one had reviewed the pattern. The security company's oversight of contracted personnel consisted of a quarterly check-in call and a review of formally logged complaints. No additional incidents had been formally logged in the 14 months between the warning and the morning of the 3rd Tuesday in November. What had not been logged because it had not been reported formally was the number of customers who had been approached in the lobby before reaching the teller line, and who had, in the specific way of people who do not want to be in a confrontation in a bank on a Tuesday morning, simply complied, who had produced their identification when asked, or who had declined politely and been allowed to proceed, or who had completed their business and left without saying anything to anyone. The pattern of the behavior was in the absence of formal complaints. The absence of formal complaints was not the absence of the behavior. He had been watching the lobby. He watched the lobby, the way people watch spaces. They have decided are subject to their supervision, cataloging, sorting, making assessments that feel to him like professional judgment, and that are in the specific way of assessments that are built on the wrong foundation, something else entirely. Dorothy Carmichael came through the door at 10:23. She walked to the teller line. She was 3rd in line. She waited. She did not look at her phone. She looked at the tellers, 2 of whom she recognized, one of whom was new in the way of a person who is present and composed and waiting for her turn. Dellert crossed the lobby to her. He said, "Can I see your ID?" Dorothy Carmichael turned and looked at him. She had spent 40 years in professional settings where she was the only black woman in the room, or one of very few. She had spent those 40 years developing a finely calibrated sense of when a question was being asked of her for legitimate professional reasons and when it was being asked of her for a reason that had nothing to do with the question. She knew the difference the way a person who has lived a particular experience long enough knows it, not from a single signal, but from the whole configuration of signals together: the approach, the tone, the timing, the specific quality of the gaze. She knew what this was. She had known it at various points in her life with varying degrees of clarity. There had been moments in her career, in board meetings, in budget negotiations, in administrative reviews, when she had not been certain whether the resistance she was meeting was about her or about the position she was taking, and she had learned to hold that uncertainty carefully and not resolve it prematurely in either direction. This was not one of those moments. This was not ambiguous. She had watched Dellard cross the lobby from the moment she walked in the door. She had seen the direction of his gaze. She had noted that he had not crossed the lobby to either of the two people who had arrived in line before her. She had noted the approach, the angle of it, the pace of it, the specific quality of the attention that preceded it. She had spent a career reading institutional dynamics, and the dynamic she was reading now was as clear as anything she had ever read. She said, "I am a customer of this bank. I am in line to conduct my business. Is there a reason you are asking me for identification?" Dellard said, "It's routine. We ask all customers." The woman behind Dorothy in line, who had been there for 4 minutes and had not been approached, said nothing. The man at the front of the line, who had been there for 7 minutes, said nothing. Dorothy looked at Dellard for a moment with the expression of a woman who has decided that she is going to document what is happening carefully and address it through the correct channels, and that what she is not going to do is pretend it is not what it is. The specific feeling of that moment, the moment in which a person has been told something incorrect about themselves by an institution that should know better and has to decide in real time what kind of answer they are going to give, was something Dorothy Carmichael knew well. She had been in that moment before. Not in this bank, not with this person, but in the general shape of this moment, which was, you do not belong here in the way I am choosing to understand belonging, and I am going to make that clear to you. She had been in that moment in a school board meeting at 38 when a board member had asked her a question about the school's budget that he had not asked any of the other principals who presented that day. She had answered the question. She had answered every question that followed with the same precision. And she had gone home that night and written in a journal entry that she later reread, "I answered every question. I was prepared for every question. I will always be prepared for every question because that is what it means to do this work while being who I am." She had been in that moment in a renovation planning session when a contractor had directed every substantive question to the male vice principal who was attending the meeting in a supporting role, and she had simply redirected each question back to herself with the specific calmness of a woman who is not going to make a scene about it and is also not going to allow it to continue. She had been in that moment enough times that she had developed over decades a response that was automatic. Not automatic in the sense of unthinking, but automatic in the sense of deeply practiced. The way a musician's hands find the right position without conscious effort because the practice has made it part of the body. The response was clarity, precision, documentation, the correct channels. The refusal to become in the moment of someone else's wrong judgment the version of herself that the wrong judgment was designed to produce. She said, "I have been a customer of this bank for 31 years. My name is Dorothy Carmichael. You will find that I have multiple accounts at this branch. I will show you my identification when the teller asks for it, which is the standard procedure for all customers conducting transactions, not the procedure applied selectively in the lobby before a customer reaches the window." She turned back to face the teller line. She was now second in line. The person ahead of her completed their transaction and moved away. She stepped to the window. Dellard stepped beside her. He said, "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Dorothy Carmichael kept her eyes on the teller. The teller, a young woman named Christine, who had been at this branch for 2 years and who recognized Dorothy and greeted her twice a month, was watching what was happening with the expression of someone who does not know what protocol applies to this situation, because this situation does not match any scenario her training covered. Dorothy said, "Hello, Christine." Christine said, "Mrs. Carmichael, how can I help you today?" Dorothy said I need to make a deposit to my savings account and a withdrawal from checking. I have the amounts written here. She slid a completed deposit slip and a withdrawal request across the counter. Dellert said, "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the window." He placed his hand on her arm. Dorothy Carmichael looked down at his hand. She looked at it the way a woman looks at something that is in the wrong place and is not going to remain there. She said, "Remove your hand from my arm." She said it quietly. She said it without raising her voice. She said it with the specific certainty of a woman who has said things in authoritative registers for 40 years and knows that volume is not where authority lives. He tightened his grip. He said, "You need to come with me. This is not a request." Christine at the window had gone still. Behind Dorothy in line, the next customer, a man in his 50s who had come in to cash a check, was watching with the specific attentiveness of someone who is witnessing something wrong and is in the process of deciding what to do about it. A woman in the far waiting area who had been filling out a deposit form at one of the standing desks had raised her phone. Her name was Adaeze Okonkwo. She was 34. She worked 2 blocks from the bank and had come in during her lunch hour. She had been in the waiting area for 8 minutes before Dorothy arrived, and she had watched Dellert cross the lobby toward Dorothy before Dorothy had even reached the teller line. She had begun recording at that point before the first word was exchanged because she recognized the approach, and she understood what it usually preceded. She had grown up in a family that talked about documentation the way other families talked about savings as something you build incrementally carefully, specifically against the day when it becomes necessary to have it. Her mother had kept files. Her grandmother had kept files. She had been told from an early age that the difference between an account and a record is that a record can be verified and a verified record can accomplish things that an unverified account cannot. She had her phone in her hand. She had held it steady. She had not moved from the standing desk. She had completed the deposit form with her other hand, while keeping the phone level with her right, because she had learned from watching other footage. She had seen over the years that the moment you make a movement that suggests you are recording is sometimes the moment the situation changes in ways that make the footage less useful, and she had decided that the most useful footage was footage taken from a stable position by someone who appears to be doing something else. She had been recording for 6 minutes and 22 seconds before Dellert placed his hand on Dorothy's arm. She had been recording for 6 minutes and 53 seconds before Gerald Osei's voice came from the direction of the back office. She had been recording for 7 minutes and 40 seconds in total when Dorothy walked toward the door and Adaeze lowered the phone and waited for her to pass, and then followed her out and pressed her card into her hand and said, "I recorded the whole thing from before he reached you. Call me." Dorothy had looked at her. She had said thank you. Adaeze had said I didn't do very much. Dorothy had said you did exactly what needed to be done. She had meant it in both the immediate sense and the longer sense, both the specific act of recording and the deeper act of deciding before she knew how it would end that it was worth recording regardless. She kept the phone steady. Dellert pulled Dorothy Carmichael back from the window. Not hard, not violently, but with the specific force of a man who has decided to move a woman and is moving her. Dorothy Carmichael said, "I need the names of your supervisors, both this bank's management and the security company that employs you. I need them now." She said it while being moved. She said it clearly and without panic. She said it the way a woman says a thing she has decided is necessary, not in anger, not in distress, in the specific register of someone who is building a record in real time. A voice from behind the teller line said, "What is going on here?" The voice belonged to a man who had come out of the back office at a pace that indicated he had been watching and had reached a decision about when to intervene. His name was Gerald Osei. He was 51. He had been the branch manager of this location for 3 years. He had come to banking in his late 20s after a decade in business administration, had moved through several roles, and had been appointed branch manager after demonstrating across 4 years at a different location, a particular capacity for managing complex customer relationships and institutional processes with equal care. He had grown up 2 miles from this branch. He had first walked into a bank at 14, sent by his mother to deposit a check, nervous and uncertain of the procedure. The teller who helped him had been patient and clear, and had treated him with the complete normality of someone simply doing a job. He had never forgotten that. He had thought about it throughout his career, especially on the days when he watched interactions in his branch go the wrong way and needed to decide how to intervene. He thought, this is what it is supposed to be. Every person who walks through this door is supposed to be treated the way that Teller treated me when I was 14 and didn't know the procedure. He maintained that standard with the specific commitment of someone who has decided that a principle is not a principle unless it is applied consistently, including on the days when applying it is complicated. He was also a meticulous man. He read the branch's customer records carefully. He knew who his long-standing customers were. He knew in the specific way that a good branch manager knows which customers had relationships with this institution that predated his tenure, and that required him to understand their history before making any assessment of a situation involving them. He knew who Dorothy Carmichael was. He had known who she was for 3 years. He crossed the lobby. He said, "Mrs. Carmichael, I apologize for this." He said it directly and without qualification. He said it in the tone of someone who has assessed the situation and reached a conclusion and is communicating the conclusion without hedging. He looked at Dellert. He said, "Please release her arm." Dellert said, "Sir, she was." Gerald Osei said, "Please release her arm." He said it the same way the second time as the first time. Same tone, same pace. The tone of a man who is giving an instruction and expects it to be followed because it is correct and because he is the one giving it. Dellert released Dorothy's arm. Osei said, "Mrs. Carmichael, please come with me. I would like to personally assist you today." He turned toward the back. He stopped. He turned around. He said, "And I should tell you so that you have the complete picture that Mrs. Carmichael has been a customer of this bank for 31 years. She has multiple accounts here. She is one of our most tenured customers, and she was for 22 years the branch manager of the Jefferson Avenue Public Library, which means she has overseen more institutional financial accounts than most of us in this building." He said it in the general direction of the lobby, not aimed at Dellert specifically, aimed at the room. Then he said to Dorothy, "Shall we?" Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, let's." She straightened her jacket a small gesture precise and walked beside him toward the back office. Behind them, the man who had been waiting to cash his check stepped to the window. Christine processed his check. Adeyeze Okonkwo lowered her phone. She had 7 minutes and 40 seconds of footage. Osei walked Dorothy to his office, which was a glass-walled room with a view of the lobby and a desk that was organized with the specific tidiness of a person who understands that organized spaces produce better decisions. He closed the door. He remained standing for a moment. He said, "I want to be honest with you about how I should have handled this before it reached the point it reached today." Dorothy said, "Go ahead." He said, "I have been aware for several months that the situation with Officer Dellert required more attention than it was getting. I had one formal record to work with the prior written warning, and the feedback I had been receiving informally from staff was consistent with the warning but had not been formally documented. I was waiting for another formal incident before escalating. That was the wrong standard. I should have escalated on the pattern of what my staff was telling me, not on the presence of another formal complaint." Dorothy said yes. He said, "I am sorry that it took this morning for me to do what I should have done months ago." Dorothy said, "I appreciate that. I want you to understand that I am going to document this conversation." He said, "I expect you to. I will sign anything you need me to sign confirming what I have said." She looked at him. She had spent 40 years taking the measure of the people she worked with, worked for, and worked against. She had developed the specific skill of a person who has been in institutions long enough to know the difference between an apology that is designed to limit liability and an apology that comes from actual understanding of what went wrong. She had heard both. She knew the difference. This was the second kind. She said, "Then let's take care of today's business and go from there." He said, "Yes, let's." He said, "I owe you a full explanation of what is going to happen next." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "First, what do you need from us today?" "Let me take care of that." She slid the deposit slip and withdrawal request across his desk. He processed both himself personally while she sat across from him. Then he said, "I want to tell you about Officer Dellert. He has been on this assignment for 14 months. He had one prior written warning in that time. I have been aware for several months that his interactions with customers required closer monitoring, and I have not moved quickly enough on that awareness. That is a failing of my management, and I am acknowledging it to you directly." She said, "I appreciate that. I would like the contact information for his security company and for whoever oversees contracted security in your regional management." He had both ready. He had prepared them before he came out of his office because he had known from the moment he started watching the exchange from the back office that this was where the conversation would go. He slid the sheet across the desk. She folded it and put it in her purse. He said, "Is there anything else I can do?" She said, "There is one more thing." She said, "In my 31 years as a customer of this bank, I have never been asked for identification in the lobby. I have been asked for identification by tellers during transactions, which is the correct procedure. What happened today was not a security protocol. It was a pattern of behavior directed at a specific type of customer. I want you to understand that I know the difference, and I want your institution to understand that I will be documenting it accordingly." Osei said, "I understand." She said, "Good." She picked up her purse. She stood. She said, "I have been coming to this bank since before you were the manager here. I would like to continue coming to this bank. What I will not do is come to a bank where the security personnel believe that my presence in the lobby requires special justification." He said, "That is not who we are." She said, "I know that's not who you are. That is why I am still sitting across from you instead of already at my lawyer's office. But knowing who you are requires knowing what you are allowing, and I am giving you the opportunity to align those two things." He said, "I will." She said, "Then we understand each other." She left. She walked through the lobby. She walked past the teller line, past Christine, who met her eyes for a moment with an expression that said everything and said nothing out loud. She walked past the standing desk where Adaeze Okonkwo was now filling out a deposit form without her phone. She walked through the door and into the November air. She sat in her car for 4 minutes before she drove anywhere. She sat with the particular stillness of a woman who has been through something and is not going to let the adrenaline of it carry her somewhere she has not chosen to go. She had spent decades learning the difference between reacting and responding, and she had spent those same decades learning that the seconds immediately after a difficult situation are the most dangerous for decision-making, because the feeling of the situation is still in the body and can drive choices that the careful mind would not make. She sat. She looked at her hands on the steering wheel. She thought about her mother Eunice, who had told her when she was 17 and had been treated unfairly at a summer job and had wanted to march back in and say everything she was feeling, sit first. Feel it first. Name what happened. Then decide what to do. Never in that order the other way around. She had sat. She had felt it. She named what had happened in sequence in the specific language of a woman who had spent a career writing institutional reports and knew the difference between a fact and an interpretation. A security officer approached me in the lobby before I reached the teller line. He asked for identification. I declined. He stated it was routine, but did not approach other customers who had been waiting longer. He followed me to the teller window. He placed his hand on my arm without authorization. He attempted to move me from the window. The bank manager intervened. The officer released my arm. Those were the facts. She had witnesses. She had video. She had 31 years of documented account history. She had a retirement that had left her with enough time and enough accumulated knowledge to know exactly what the correct channels were and how to use them. She did what she had learned to do over 40 years of managing things that required managing. She took inventory. She named the facts in sequence. She identified what she had and what she needed. She decided what the next step was. She had Gerald Osei's card with his direct number. She had the security company's contact information. She had the regional management's contact number. She had the time of the incident, the name of the security officer, and the name of Adaeze Okonkwo, who had approached her in the lobby on the way out and pressed a card into her hand and said, "I recorded the whole thing from before he reached you. Call me." She had, in other words, what was necessary. She also had something she had not expected, the specific feeling of a woman who has been in a difficult situation and has come through it without losing herself, who has been moved by someone who did not have the right to move her, and has moved herself back with complete composure. She had been in rooms where she was not respected before. She had navigated all of them through the same method clarity documentation and the refusal to accept the definition of herself that the room was trying to impose. She had not accepted it today. She drove home. Her daughter Yolanda called that evening. They spoke every Tuesday, which had been their practice since Yolanda moved to Columbus 4 years ago. Dorothy told her what had happened. She told it the way she told everything in sequence, with specific details, without editorializing until the facts were complete. She told Yolanda about Dellert's approach in the lobby, about the 2 people in line before her who had not been approached, about the exchange at the teller window, and the grip on her arm about Gerald Osei coming out of the back office. She told Yolanda what Osei had said when he addressed the lobby about her 31 years, about her career managing the library's institutional accounts. Yolanda was quiet for a moment. Then she said he said all of that out loud in the lobby. Dorothy said yes. Yolanda said to Dellert. Dorothy said to the room generally, but Dellert was in the room. Yolanda said, Mom, he told that man who you were. Dorothy said he did. Yolanda said, and what did Dellert do? Dorothy said he released my arm and didn't say anything else. Yolanda was quiet again. Then she said, I want to know what Osei's face looked like when he said it. Dorothy said, composed. Very composed. The way a person looks when they have made a decision and are completely at peace with it. Yolanda said, I would have liked to see that. Dorothy said, it is on the footage. Yolanda said, Adayez got all of it. Dorothy said, all of it. She started recording before he reached me. There was a pause. Yolanda said, Mom, I want to come down. Dorothy said, you do not need to come down. Yolanda said, I know I don't need to. I want to. Dorothy said, I will call you Thursday after the attorney. If I need you, I will tell you. Yolanda said, promise. Dorothy said, I have been making promises you can count on since before you were born. Yolanda said, are you all right? Dorothy said, I am fine. I'm documenting. Yolanda said, Mom. Dorothy said, what? Yolanda said, I want to come down there. Dorothy said, you do not need to come down here. I have what I need. I have an appointment with a civil rights attorney on Thursday. I have 7 minutes and 40 seconds of footage from a woman named Adayez, who had the good sense to start recording before the man reached me. I have the bank manager's card and his sincere apologies and his cooperation, which is worth something. Yolanda said, are you sure you're all right? Dorothy said, Yolanda, I managed a public library for 22 years. I have been in rooms where people decided before I opened my mouth what I was worth. I know how to manage those rooms. Today, I was managed in mine. And now I am going to address it through every correct channel available to me. Yolanda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, okay. Dorothy said, okay. Yolanda said, but call me Thursday after the attorney. Dorothy said, I will call you Thursday after the attorney. She had also thought about Adayeze Okonkwo during those 4 minutes in the car. She had thought about the specific thing Adayeze had done, raised her phone before the first word was exchanged. Not after. Not when the situation escalated. Before, from the moment of the approach, from the angle and the direction of it, from the quality of the attention that preceded the interaction. She had seen it in the approach itself, had recognized it as something that needed to be recorded, and had made the decision to record it without waiting to be certain. That was not nothing. That was the specific skill of a person who has seen enough of a particular kind of situation to recognize it in its earliest form before the person it is happening to has even had time to process that it is happening. Dorothy had been that person before. She had been the person in that lobby on the receiving end of that particular quality of attention more times than she could easily count. And on some of those occasions, she had not had a Adayeze Okonkwo. She had had only her own account of what happened against the official account of whatever institution was involved, and she had had to decide whether that asymmetry was worth fighting through. Sometimes it had been. Sometimes it had not been worth it. Not because the wrong was less real, but because the cost of fighting it was more than she had been willing to pay, and she had made that calculation and moved forward, which was also a form of survival. Today was different. Today she had 7 minutes and 40 seconds of footage, a bank manager who had done the right thing and a teller who had filed her own report before the day was over. She was going to use what she had. The civil rights attorney was a woman named Patricia Otto, who had practiced for 19 years and had handled 11 cases involving racial discrimination in commercial settings, of which 8 had resulted in settlements. 2 were still pending, and 1 had gone to trial and produced a verdict that was subsequently cited in 3 subsequent cases. Dorothy arrived at the appointment 15 minutes early with a 2-page written summary of the incident in chronological order. A copy of her 31-year account history, printed from the bank's online portal, the contact information for Adaeze Okonkwo, and Gerald Osei's card. Patricia Addo looked at the 2-page summary. She read it without speaking. She read it the way a lawyer reads a document, not for the narrative, but for the structure, for what was included and what was excluded, and what the order of the information revealed about the writer's understanding of what mattered most. She read it twice. She said, "You wrote this yourself." Dorothy said, "I wrote it this morning." Patricia said, "The morning after." Dorothy said, "I wrote it at 5 a.m. I woke up at 4:30, and I could not go back to sleep, so I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table and wrote everything down in sequence while it was still clear." Patricia said, "Did you change anything from the first draft?" Dorothy said, "The order of 2 sections. The substance remained the same." Patricia said, "You missed your calling." Dorothy said, "I was a librarian." Patricia said, "Librarians know exactly how information should be arranged, so that the right person finds the right thing at the right time." Dorothy said, "That's more or less what I was aiming for." Patricia said, "It shows." She set the summary down and looked at the account history. She said, 31 years, multiple accounts, institutional accounts for the library system. Dorothy said, "Yes." Patricia said, "I want to understand something. Did the officer interact with you before or after you reached the teller line?" Dorothy said, "Before. I was third in line. He crossed the lobby while I was in the line. The 2 people in front of me had been in line for 4 minutes and 7 minutes respectively." Patricia said, "And he had not approached either of them." Dorothy said, "Correct." Patricia said, "I'm going to need a statement from Christine. Do you have her last name?" Dorothy said, "I don't, but Gerald Osei has it and will provide it." Patricia said, "And you have Adaeze Okonkwo's contact?" Dorothy said, "I have her card." Patricia said, "Then we have what we need. Let me explain what I am going to do with it." The formal complaint was filed with the State Banking Commission, the security company, and the bank's regional compliance office within the week. The complaint included the video footage, the chronological account, the documentation of Dellert's prior written warning, and the specific language regarding the pattern of conduct, the approach in the lobby before Dorothy had reached the teller line, the failure to approach other customers who had been waiting longer, the physical contact made after Dorothy had expressly declined to comply with an unauthorized request. Dellert's security contract with the bank was terminated within 10 days. The security company issued a formal statement acknowledging the conduct and confirming the termination. The bank issued a separate statement acknowledging what had occurred and expressing its commitment to ensuring all customers were treated with equal dignity. Gerald Osei called Dorothy 2 weeks after the termination. He had also written her a letter which arrived 3 days before the call. The letter was on bank stationery, formal in its structure, and said 3 specific things: that he regretted the incident, that he took personal responsibility for failing to act sooner on the pattern he had observed in Dellert's conduct, and that the branch's commitment to every customer, regardless of how long they had banked there or what they had built in their professional lives, would be reflected in the practices the branch put in place going forward. He had hand-signed it. Dorothy had read it twice and placed it in the file she was keeping. He said, "I want you to know that the regional management has initiated a review of all contracted security personnel across the branch network. The review was prompted in part by your complaint and in part by the Adaeze Okonkwo footage, which has now been seen by every level of our management chain." Dorothy said, "Good." He said, "I also want you to know that Christine the teller, who was at your window, filed her own internal report about the incident the day it occurred. She documented what she witnessed. That report was part of the record." Dorothy said, "Christine?" He said, "Yes." Dorothy said, "She's been there 2 years." He said, "Yes, she is a good teller." Dorothy said, "She is. Give her my regards." She continued banking at First Meridian on Tanner Avenue. She had considered in the days after the incident and before the resolution whether she wanted to continue at this branch. She had thought about it the way she thought about all consequential decisions, by identifying what the options were, what each option would cost, and what each option would produce. She could move her accounts. She had 31 years at this branch, but 31 years is a history, not a sentence. Banks are banks. She could rebuild a relationship elsewhere. The cost of moving would be administrative several hours of paperwork and account transfers, and the benefit would be the clean feeling of having removed herself from a place where something wrong had been done to her. She had sat with that option for 3 days. Then she had decided not to take it, not because the wrong had not happened, not because it wasn't her right to leave, but because the thing Osei had done, and the thing Christine had done in filing her report, and the thing the regional management had done in initiating the network-wide review, those things deserved a response that was not departure. Those things deserved a customer who came back, who continued to use the branch, who allowed her continued presence to be the evidence that the situation had been addressed and the relationship had been repaired. She had earned the right to be in that bank. She had had the right for 31 years. She was not going to relinquish it because one person had tried to make her feel like she didn't have it. She went in the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. Christine was at the second window and greeted her by name. The new contracted security officer, a woman in her 50s, who had been on assignment there for 1 week, was at the door and said good morning to each person who came in without approaching anyone in the lobby. Dorothy made her deposits. She made her withdrawals. She noted in the journal she had been keeping since the incident that the new officer had said good morning to every single person who came through the door in the order in which they arrived. She noted it because it was the correct behavior, and because correct behavior deserves to be recorded as carefully as incorrect behavior. She had started the journal the day after the incident, a new journal separate from the ones she had kept during her working years, which she understood to have been the journals of a professional, and this to be something different. This was the record of what happened to a 68-year-old woman on a Tuesday morning in November, and what she did about it and what came from what she did. She kept it with the same discipline she kept everything. Dated entries, specific facts, named individuals, verified information only clearly distinguished from her own interpretation when interpretation was necessary. She had been writing in it for 6 weeks. It was already 41 pages. She thought about what she would do with it eventually, whether it would be useful to anyone other than herself, whether there was a way to make it available to Patricia Addo for other cases, whether the specific details of how she had navigated the process from the parking lot to the library steps might be something another person in a similar situation would find useful to have. She had not decided yet. She had time to decide. She closed the journal and put it in her bag and went home for dinner. 41 pages, she thought as she walked to her car. That was a record worth keeping. The formal complaint process moved through its stages with the specific momentum of a well-documented case handled by a well-prepared attorney on behalf of a client who could not be dismissed. The security company's regional director was interviewed twice. He was shown the footage on the first interview. He was shown the prior written warning on the second. He was asked directly what review process had been initiated after the prior warning, and what oversight had been increased following the warning. He was unable to produce documentation of any review or any increased oversight. The bank's compliance officer reviewed the branch's incident reports for the prior 14 months and identified 3 additional instances in which a customer had documented in writing submitted to the teller a concern about the security officer's approach. None of the 3 had been escalated to the security company. None had been addressed. The compliance officer acknowledged this in a written statement that Patricia Addo added to the record without comment because it required none. Gerald Osei provided a full written account of what he had observed from his office and of the steps he had taken after Dorothy left. He had called the security company's regional director within an hour of the incident. He had called his own regional manager within 2 hours. He had filed an internal incident report that afternoon. He had spoken with Christine and taken her account and attached it to his report as a supporting document. Patricia Addo read his account and said he did everything correctly on the day. Dorothy said he did. Patricia said, and he did it because he knew who you were. Dorothy said yes. Patricia said, I want to make sure we note in the complaint what would have happened if he hadn't known who you were. Dorothy said noted. It was noted. The complaint included in its analysis section a specific paragraph about the structural question embedded in the incident. The resolution had depended on the branch manager's personal knowledge of this specific customer's 31-year history. A customer with a shorter history or a customer whose account records had been less reviewed by the current manager would have had no such recourse within the building itself. The structural problem was not that the manager failed to act. The structural problem was that the correct action required the manager to know something that should not have been necessary to know, because the correct action should have been the same regardless of who the customer was and how long she had been a customer. Dorothy had written that paragraph herself at Patricia's request because she had articulated the point clearly in their second meeting, and Patricia had said, "Write that down exactly as you just said it." Adeyeze Okonkwo had never met Dorothy Carmichael before the day she raised her phone in the lobby of First Meridian Bank. She worked 2 blocks away in a consulting office, and she had come in during her lunch hour to handle a simple banking matter. She had been in that bank dozens of times. She had also been in that bank enough times to know when she was watching something that needed to be documented. She said when Dorothy called to thank her, "I didn't do very much. I just kept my phone up." Dorothy said that is exactly the right amount. She said, "I want to ask you something. Were you afraid?" Adeyeze said, "Not afraid. Something else. Something like this is wrong, and it is being done in front of me. And I have the ability to document it accurately, and I am going to document it accurately, and I will deal with whatever comes from that." Dorothy said that is courage. Adeyeze said, "I wasn't thinking about courage. I was thinking about accuracy." Dorothy said those are usually the same thing. They met for coffee 3 weeks after the resolution. Dorothy had called and proposed it, which was her way. She did not let important things drift into the category of things that are left unfinished out of inertia. Adeyeze had said yes. They met at a small coffee shop 4 blocks from the bank. Dorothy arrived first and was at a table by the window when Adeyeze came in. They talked for 90 minutes. Dorothy learned that Adeyeze had come to this country from Nigeria at 9, that she had grown up in a household where both her parents had worked in healthcare, that she had gone to school for business, and had spent the past 6 years in a consulting role that she found genuinely interesting. She learned that Adeyeze had started recording in that lobby, not only because she recognized the pattern of the approach, but because she had been in a situation 3 years prior where something wrong had happened to someone she cared about, and there had been no footage, and the absence of footage had made the difference between an account that could be acted on and one that could not. She had decided that day 3 years ago that if she was ever again in a position to document something that needed documenting, she would document it. She had not had to use the decision for 3 years. On the 3rd Tuesday of November, she had used it. Dorothy said the footage changed everything. Not just for me. The bank's compliance review looked at the footage for the network-wide assessment of contracted security practices. The security company's termination decision was made faster because of the footage. The policy changes were grounded in what the footage showed. Adeyeze said, "I know. Patricia Addo's office sent me a summary." Dorothy said she sent you a summary. Adeyeze said she believed witnesses were entitled to know the outcomes of the things they witnessed. Dorothy said she's right about that. Adeyeze said she is. They sat for a moment. Dorothy said, "I want to ask you something." Adeyeze said, "Go ahead." Dorothy said, "What would you have done if Dellert had seen the phone and confronted you about it?" Adeyeze was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I would have kept recording." Dorothy said, "Yes." She said, "Yes, I thought that's what you would have said." She picked up her coffee. She said, "Good." The civil rights complaint was resolved 6 weeks after filing. The resolution did not include litigation. Dorothy had been specific about that, had told Patricia Addo that she did not want this to become a courtroom proceeding, if the institutional response was genuine and the accountability was real. The accountability was real. The resolution included formal acknowledgments from both the security company and the bank, a policy change in how contracted security personnel were trained and supervised at commercial banking institutions, and a financial settlement that Dorothy donated in its entirety to the Jefferson Avenue Public Library's Children's Programming Fund. The Dorothy E. Carmichael Children's Reading Room received a new collection of picture books. There were 214 of them, one for each week of the 4 years since she had retired. She had not asked for that condition. It had come from the settlement negotiation. Patricia Addo had proposed it, and the other side's counsel had agreed after consulting with their clients. Dorothy had approved it when Patricia presented it, and she had felt in approving it the specific satisfaction of a person who has found a way to make a wrong produce something that will outlast the wrong. The Children's Programming Fund had been in need of replenishment. The prior fiscal year had seen a reduction in city funding that had required the library to cut 2 programs it had offered for 6 consecutive years. The $700 from the banking settlement, combined with a matching contribution from a private donor whom the library director had contacted after hearing about the resolution, had funded the restoration of one of those programs and the pilot of a new one. 43 children enrolled in the restored program in its first semester back. Dorothy did not know all 43 by name. She was retired. She had not known the children at the library as individuals, in the same way she had known the staff and the administration during her tenure. But she knew the director who called her periodically with updates, and the director had told her the number, and the director had told her about 3 specific children whose parents had specifically cited the restoration of the program as the reason they had enrolled. Dorothy kept that in the same mental file where she kept everything that mattered organized, retrievable, specific. She delivered them on a Saturday morning with Yolanda, who had come down from Columbus for the occasion. Yolanda helped her carry them in. She said, "Mom." Dorothy said, "What?" Yolanda said, "You got 214 picture books from a security guard at a bank." Dorothy said, "I got 214 picture books from 31 years of correct banking behavior and the good sense to document what happens when someone tries to make you feel like you don't belong somewhere you have always belonged." Yolanda said, "That is a very long way of saying yes." Dorothy said, "It is. It is also accurate." She placed the last box on the circulation desk. She looked at the bronze plaque on the wall. The Dorothy E. Carmichael Children's Reading Room. She had not cried at the dedication because she was the one being dedicated to and the role required composure. She did not cry now either. But she stood for a moment with her hand on the last box of books. 214 books for children she had not yet met in a room that bore her name, and she let herself feel the specific satisfaction of a woman who has spent a life building things correctly and has found again and again that things built correctly do not fall when they are pushed. She thought about her mother Eunice, who had told her to sit first, feel it first, name what happened, and then decide what to do. She had sat. She had felt it. She had named it. A security officer at a bank had decided on a Tuesday morning that her presence in the lobby required special justification. He had been wrong. Not wrong in the way of a misunderstanding. Wrong in the specific way of someone who had been applying the same wrong judgment to the same category of person for 14 months, and had not been stopped because no one had looked at the pattern of what he was doing closely enough to see it for what it was. She had named it. She had decided what to do. She had done it. And now 214 picture books were in a room with her name on it, and 43 children would use that room this semester, and 3 of them were there specifically because a program had been restored from a settlement that had come from a security officer who had put his hand on a 68-year-old black woman's arm in a bank lobby and made the mistake of doing it in front of someone who started recording before he reached her. Yolanda picked up the empty box from the floor. She said, "What are you thinking about?" Dorothy said, "I'm thinking about 43 children." Yolanda said, "The ones in the program." Dorothy said, "Yes." Yolanda said, "Do you know their names?" Dorothy said, "Not yet. But I know the director. She'll tell me." Yolanda said, "Of course she will." Dorothy said she told me about 3 of them. Their parents enrolled them specifically because the program came back. She told me their first names. Yolanda said, "What are their names?" Dorothy said, "Marcus and Keziah and a little girl named Ellie." Yolanda said nothing for a moment. Dorothy said, "I wrote them in my journal." Yolanda said, "Mom." Dorothy said, "What?" Yolanda said, "You are something." Dorothy said, "I am your mother. That is the specific thing that I am." She picked up her coat. She looked at the plaque one more time. She looked at it the way she had been looking at it for 4 years, with the particular combination of pride and clarity that comes from understanding exactly what it represents and exactly what it cost. She turned and walked out through the children's reading room, past the shelves, past the reading chairs, sized for small people, past the window that looked onto Orchard Street, the street where Eunice had raised 4 children in a house that taught them to sit first, and feel it first, and name what happened, and then decide what to do. She walked outside. She stood on the steps of the Jefferson Avenue Public Library in the November light in her dark green wool coat next to her daughter. She thought about the summer when she had first taken the principal's position at East Side Elementary and had walked into a room full of parents who did not know her, and some of whom had not been expecting her, and all of whom had been watching her. And she had stood at the front of the room and introduced herself, and told them what she was going to do and how she was going to do it, and why she believed it was the right approach for their children's school. She had been 39. She had not been afraid. She had been ready. She was 68 now. She was still ready. The reading glasses on the chain around her neck caught the light. She thought, I have been doing this for a long time. She thought, I intend to keep doing it. They hold, and then they stand a little straighter. Subscribe our channel. We tell the stories of the people who hold.